Now before I move on, I just want to take a few moments to explain depth of field. The American Cinematographer Manual defines depth of field as the range in front and behind a designated focusing distance where an object still appears to be acceptably in focus. To demonstrate the concepts of depth of field, I've created this simulation using the 3D camera in After Effects. The three words you see are actually all the exact same font size, but just placed at different distances from the virtual camera. Now let's rack focus to the word depth, just so we can demonstrate the use of selective focus. Selective focus is very, very important in dramatic film production. We'll just shift our words up here so we can make room for our virtual measuring tape. Now you can see on the measuring tape that the word depth is about 7 feet from the focal plane. Let's bring it back to the word field, and we're at 4 feet from the focal plane. And the camera way back there is about 30 feet from the focal plane. This simulation is currently set to a 35mm focal length at f4 using the Super 35 frame size. There are four main factors that affect apparent depth of field. They are focal length, aperture f-stop, focus distance or object distance, and the circle of confusion. The circle of confusion defines how far an image can go out of focus before it becomes unacceptable. This value can be quite subjective depending on the eventual viewing size and distance of the image. Circle of confusion is not a factor we can control in the field, but we need to determine what value to use when reading depth of field charts. Now let's move on to something that we can control, and that is focus distance. As you can see here, the object closest to the camera seems to have a very short depth of field. If we rack focus to 7 feet, which is where the word depth is, the word field, although it is out of focus, is nowhere near as blurry as the word depth was when field was in focus. We'll just rack back to the 4-foot distance and back again to the 7-foot distance. So as you can see, as a general rule of thumb, objects that are much closer to the focal plane will actually have a shorter depth of field than objects that are further away from the focal plane. Now I'll rack focus to our object in the background, and when I look up on my depth of field chart, it tells me that the near focus is 15 feet and the far focus is 67 feet. So as you can see, as we focus much further away from the lens, the depth of field extends greatly, and when we focus back to the object closest to the lens, it is reduced. Now let's talk about aperture f-stop. The current f-stop set on this simulation is f4. So now let's stop down to f8 and observe the effects on the depth of field. The apparent depth of field increases as I stop down. It is still quite short, but we can actually read the numbers on either side of the 4-foot marker now. If we open the aperture up to f2, you can see that the depth of field becomes very, very short, and the word depth is barely readable. The object in the background is just a big blur. Aperture has a great effect on depth of field. So I'll just bring the aperture back to f4 and we'll explore the number one depth of field factor on our list, focal length. Focal length refers to how wide or telephoto our lens is. Shorter focal lengths allow for wider angles of view, but they also deepen the depth of field. This is where the size of the imaging sensor comes into play. As I mentioned before, this simulation is currently set for a 35mm focal length. In the Super 35 format, this would be considered a normal lens with an angle of view close to that of the human eye. Now what happens if we use this same focal length on a 1/3 inch camera? The depth of field characteristics haven't changed, only the viewable area. The problem is that the 1/3 inch CCD sensor is so much smaller than the Super 35 gate that our wide shot has now become telephoto. So what is the net result of this cropping factor? Well, if we don't want to move our tripod or camera, it means that we'll need to use a much wider lens to achieve the same angle of view. I'll zoom this virtual lens out to demonstrate. Keep your eye on the small 1/3 inch frame in the center. Now, I have not moved the camera or adjusted the focus. We are still 4 feet from the word focus and 7 feet from the word depth. But our focal length is now around 6 millimeters instead of 35. Let's bring the little 1/3 inch CCD full screen and peek at the depth of field. Wow, the shorter focal length is really deep in the depth of field. So much so that almost everything is now acceptably in focus. Let's do a quick comparison with our 35mm frame, just to see the difference. Super 35, 1/3 inch. Super 35, 1/3 inch. Now I know some of you are sitting there thinking, why not just move the camera back and use a longer focal length? Zooming in and moving back is how you always get short depth of field, right? Not quite. There seems to be an accepted myth that moving the camera further away from the subject and zooming in will decrease the depth of field. In reality, that isn't actually happening. I'm going to show you why. I'll bring in a background in the distance to help demonstrate. Remember back when I spoke about focus distance and the fact that focusing closer to the lens shortens the depth of field and focusing further away deepens it. And as we just discussed, longer focal lengths shorten the depth of field and shorter focal lengths deepen the depth of field. So if you move a camera back from the subject and zoom in, it means that you also need to adjust the focus further from the camera. These two acts almost completely cancel each other out, and the depth of field actually remains unchanged. The words are just as in focus as they always were, but the side effect is that we have narrowed the angle of view and magnified the background. The individual elements in the background are just as blurry as they've always been. The objects at different distances have been sandwiched together, and they all appear to be the same size now. So I guess the moral of the story here is that there isn't much you can do to shorten the depth of field without using unconventional means. And that's where lens adapters come into play. From the home-built versions that sell for a few $100s to the very professionally engineered P&S Technique Mini 35, these adapters all utilize the exact same concept. An image is projected by a cine lens onto a focusing screen or ground glass equivalent in size to 35mm or 16mm. The relatively larger size of the projected image allows for the use of longer focal length lenses and therefore shorter depth of field. The projected image is then rephotographed with a relay lens connected to the 1/3 inch CCD camera. The results are very convincing. Here's some footage shot with the Mini 35. And here's some other footage shot with the very popular Red Rock Micro M2. There are a few things to consider when using a typical cine lens adapter. First of all, the ground glass and focus screens utilized in most systems have a light loss averaging around 2 stops. Secondly, the grain is usually visible in the ground glass or focus screen, and therefore most adapters employ a rotating or oscillating system to scatter the grain. This unfortunately requires battery power and sometimes it creates audible noise. From a cinematographer's standpoint, the ground glass would seem to be the weakest link in these systems. So what would happen if the ground glass was taken out of the optical path? The engineers at JVC have done just that and released the HZ-CA13U Cine Lens adapter. This new Cine Lens adapter has no ground glass or focusing screen. Cine lenses, attached to the industry standard PL mount, focus an aerial image on a virtual focal plane at the standard 52mm flange distance, maintaining the angle of view and circle of confusion depth of field characteristics of 16mm film. 11 optical elements in the adapter then reduce the size of the image down to 1/3 inch CCD while compensating for the aberrations of the color prism in the camera. I recently had a chance to test this new adapter. I tested angle of view, transmittance, sharpness, chromatic aberration, and depth of field characteristics, and compared the results to a standard 1/3 inch video zoom lens, as well as the same prime lenses on a Super 16 Arri SR3. I found that the HZ-CA13U has an equivalent angle of view of standard 16